Well, I think it's time to get started, and I want to thank you for your patience. We had intended to start a little bit earlier, but we had to organize a few things. So give yourselves a round of applause for your patience. I would like to welcome everyone to today's panel, Black Women Rule, a historic conversation with the powerful Black women leaders in government who are taking on Wall Street and solving the housing crisis. I must also thank our distinguished panelists for joining us here today to discuss their very important work. When I came to Congress in 1991, I was among a small group of recently elected Black women. At the beginning of Congress, there were 25 Black women in the House, the most in our nation's history. Representation matters. It matters in Congress. It matters in the boardroom. It matters in our federal agency. And I'm so pleased we're able to witness history being made here with this most important panel. Before I even introduce them, give them a round of applause. Again, when I became the first chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee, I made it a priority to create the first ever subcommittee on diversity and inclusion, chaired by Representative Joyce Beatty. In the subcommittee works across the financial services industry to drive accountability and transparency, to research topics of concern, and to pass legislation to improve the economic outcomes of all people, and especially people of color. In June, the House passed my landmark bill, the Financial Services Racial Equity, Inclusion, and Economic Justice Act. This bill worked to enhance racial equality in mortgages, lending, and investment. It holds banks, corporations, and financial institutions accountable for denying access to capital to millions. So I look forward to the Senate taking up the bill and being signed by the President. Every time I work on legislation, I ensure that inclusion is at the center. And when we passed Dodd-Frank, the reform bill in 2010, I made sure that we included a number of provisions to make our markets and our institutions work for people of color. Notably, I aided provisions to develop the offices of minority and women inclusion at all of the major financial regulatory agencies, including Treasury, the SEC, the FDIC, the NCUA, the Federal Reserve, and OCC. These offices not only gather and report data on how the agencies themselves are doing in terms of diversity and inclusion, but also they are regulating all of these entities and really including the banks, publicly traded companies, so on and so on. And since becoming chairwoman, I have called on this administration to keep its commitment and promote greater racial and gender equity. I'm happy to report that the Biden administration has kept its promise and appointed diverse leaders, and in particular, Black women, to lead the way. And so while we have come a long way in terms of representation, we have much further to go to ensure that Black women are able to reach economic equity. Indeed, September 21st marked Black Women's Equity Pay Day. That is, an average Black woman would have to work an additional 9 months and 21 days to make the same income as a white man. This has to change. Now, the majority of publicly traded companies have a woman or person of color sitting on its board. However, there's still too few women of color in these roles. The housing gap continues to grow, and the current fight to curb inflation has led to dramatic increases in interest rates that are shutting out first-time home buyers and buyers of color. So I look forward to our conversation today to highlight the good work that we have completed and a chart to path forward. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce each of our distinguished panelists. Our first panelist is my friend, my colleague who served in the House of Representatives with me, the Honorable Marcia L. Fudge. She is the 18th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. In this role, Secretary Fudge, who is also a member of President Biden's cabinet, oversees most of our government's resources dedicated to supporting the housing market, including all of public housing, assistance for renters and homeowners, and critical programs specifically designed to address our nation's homelessness crisis. So you may not be aware that Secretary Fudge is also involved in building up communities by administering the Community Development Block Grant Program, which also has funding that specifically goes to communities recovering from natural disasters, like in Puerto Rico and Florida. Secretary Fudge previously served in the United States House of Representatives, representing Ohio's 11th Congressional District. While there, she chaired the Congressional Black Caucus and earned a reputation for tackling unique challenges in her district, in the Democratic caucus, and with her Republican colleagues. Prior to coming to Washington, Secretary Fudge was the first woman and first black mayor of Warrensville Heights, Ohio. Is Ohio in the room? Oh, all right. For her entire career, from serving as mayor to being the leading voice in the government on housing, all the housing issues that we deal with, Secretary Fudge has dedicated her life to helping low-income families, seniors, and communities of color all across this country. Secretary Fudge, I want to thank you so much for appearing on this panel today. Big round of applause. Next, it is my pleasure to welcome the Honorable Sandra L. Thompson, who is the... Now, this is the first black woman to serve as director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, FHFA. FHFA promotes access to mortgage credit nationwide and protects the housing finance system from the oversight, all through the oversight of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the 11 banks that comprise the Federal Home Loan Bank System. FHFA works to restore and maintain confidence in the mortgage market following the 2008 financial crisis. Given the importance of housing and housing finance to our economy, Director Thompson is one of 10 voting members of the Financial Stability Oversight Control Council, or the FSOC, which is tasked with identifying and addressing any risks to the United States financial system. Prior to her current appointment, Director Thompson served as Deputy Director of the Division of Housing Mission and Goals. She joined FHFA after a distinguished 23-year career at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that's FDIC, leading the agency's examination and enforcement program at the height of the financial crisis. Ms. Thompson is a seasoned financial regulator and has proven to successfully lead under pressure and during crisis to ensure the American public and its investments are protected. Director Thompson, thank you so much for appearing on this panel today. Give her a big round of applause. And finally, we have Ms. Erica Y. Williams, who is the chair of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. That's the PCAOB. The PCAOB was established as part of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which was signed into law in response to the Enron accounting scandal of the early 2000s. You remember that? PCAOB provides oversight and enforcement of our country's accounting firms, which ensure that the financial statements of America's publicly traded company are accurate and timely. The importance of the agency that Chair Williams leads should not be underestimated. America's investors, including all of the pension funds, make their investment decisions based on the accuracy of the financial statements from these companies. By holding accounting firms to account, PCAOB is on the front lines of taking on Wall Street by protecting our investors and pension funds. Chair Williams joined the PCAOB from Kirkland & Ellis LLP, where she was a litigation partner. Previously, she was a very special assistant and associate counsel to President Barack Obama, advising the president and his senior advisors on legal and constitutional issues involving economic policy, financial regulation and reform, financial technology, trade, intellectual property, and data collection and privacy. Before that, Chair Williams spent 11 years at the SEC, serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for 3 chairs. She is a stalwart advocate for investors and ensuring they have the information necessary to make the very best decisions for themselves and their families. So, Chair Williams, I want to thank you for joining us at today's panel. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists. I thank you for your kind attention in listening to those introductions. I really could have shortened it by saying we got some bad sisters on this panel, taking care of big business. So thank you, and I'm going to start with Secretary Fudge. You're welcome to give your opening remarks. I think so. Well, you have a microphone right near you. Would you prefer here? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I still call her Madam Chair. She is the chair that all of us revere. Maxine has done more for people of color than any other single person I can think of. She takes on every battle and she leads the way. Maxine just likes to fight, but I just fight right with you. So, Madam Chair, thank you so much for having me. I think that you are just the most wonderful person. I saw the chair of the CBC, Joyce Beatty, someplace here. Did she leave? I also saw Lisa Rice, who fights for fair housing every single day in this country. So I thank you for that. I was asked to just say what it means to have me in this role, and I'm going to do it as briefly as I possibly can. I'm a kid who grew up in an all-black neighborhood, in a house, a 2-family house, Maxine, where on one side was my great-grandparents, my aunt and uncle, their 6 children, and then my uncle, my grandmother's brother. On our side was my grandparents, my mother, my brother, and I, my aunt and her 2 kids. We grew up in this house. We had clean clothes, we had food on the table, and a roof over our heads. We never even knew we were poor. Because home makes a difference. It gives you a place to feel safe, a foundation, a place where you can go and no one ever questions who you are. It makes you strong to not have to worry where you're going to sleep at night. A home is about the most important thing anyone can have, and I was fortunate to have it. I still have friends that came out of that same neighborhood. And I would say to you that the hardest thing that any of us do is carry the hopes and dreams of the people we left behind. And so that is why I am pleased to be here today. Because I am here, we are looking at things like making sure that we can close the racial wealth gap. We are making sure that we can say to people that housing is less affordable today than it has been in modern history. That the housing gap between black and white is as big as it was in 1968. But we know how we can make some changes in it. So because I'm here, we're looking at how we neutralize student loan debt so that black people are not considered to be not creditworthy. Because I'm here, we're now going to start to look at rental history so that if you make your rental payments on time, we're going to give you credit based upon your making your payments on time, because so many black people and brown people and poor people don't have a credit history. We know that most people like us who live in apartments or other places can pay our rents. We just don't have down payment money. So we're asking for down payment assistance because we're here. We're making sure that your neighborhood is not going to be devalued just because black people live in it. My house is valued at $25,000 less than the house 2 doors from me because I live in an all-black neighborhood and I live right next door to an all-white one. And so I'm losing value every single year, although my house, in my opinion, is nicer. My house is bigger. My house is better. But my house is valued at $25,000 less, so we are looking at how we do that. We are making sure that people who live in public housing are treated with dignity and respect. And lastly, we are making sure that we can bring families back together, Madam Chair. Those who have come out of the criminal justice system should be able to reunite with their families if they are not violent criminals, but we won't let them live in public housing. We won't let them live in Section 8 housing, and so we keep families apart. We're doing what I believe is the work that everyone should understand, and I say this as I take my seat. If I can't say to people in this country that if you don't see that I care, I have not done my job. If you don't see that government can work for you, then I have not done my job. And if I can't make change in this short window of time that I have in this role, then I have not done my job. And trust, I do not believe in failure. Thank you so much.
I tell you, it is hard to follow Chair Waters and Secretary Fudge. So please indulge me, if you would. I am so honored to be here and just invited to sit up on the stage where I can learn and take in and grow and develop and do what I'm supposed to do. It is just a rarity. I've been in government 30 years in areas that have historically not had representation by either females or certainly not by African Americans. So it is really a privilege for me to be here today and for me to serve in this position. I spent 30 years in the mortgage business and banking business, and a couple more years before that in the industry. But I don't want to go too far because it'll tell my age, but I don't mind that. But just for those of you who don't know, FHFA was created in response to the Great Recession, and that was certainly caused by years of unsustainable predatory lending practices. And you know where those predatory lending practices took place. You know whose neighborhoods those predatory practices took place, where people ended up with loans that they didn't understand and loans that they couldn't afford. And so when the housing market collapsed, it took down entire neighborhoods and communities and generations of progress in closing the racial wealth gap, because a house, as many of you know, is really the cornerstone for equity for most families. And so the progress that was made was certainly eradicated during the Great Recession. And as the Secretary said, the gaps are now wider than they were in the 60s when discrimination was actually legal. Now, our job at FHFA is to make sure that our regulated entities, Fannie, Freddie, and the home loan banks, really promote sustainable and affordable access to mortgage credit, and that this reaches everybody on equitable terms. And it's interesting to me because equity and equality are two different terms. You can, and the thing that I use to illustrate this is you can buy everybody in the house a bicycle, you can buy everybody a 10-speed, but you don't give a 10-speed to a 5-year-old. You give them a bicycle that has training wheels. So everybody doesn't need the same thing. And so that principle not only applies for things in households, but they apply for the mortgage process. And so there are different circumstances that we all have to encounter based on where we live, how we grew up, and certainly our household income. And so we've been really working to try to get Fannie and Freddie to focus on equitable issues. We've asked them to develop equitable housing plans so that they can look at underserved communities that have traditionally been left out of housing and come up with solutions to remove some of these barriers. You know, I really think that there's so much that we can do. We've been having this conversation for at least 30 years, and it's really time to make sure that we have some achievable results. I'm tired of talking about it. I really want us to be about it. You know, I'm going to end. I was thinking about this scripture, you know, to whom much is given, much is required. And I hope, as Secretary Fudge says, I was certainly blessed to be in this position. I never expected it. One, because I did not think this door would be open for me. And two, there had never been, as far as I could tell, a career civil servant, and certainly not one of color, that was a female as well to serve in this position. So I don't take my responsibilities lightly. So I encourage you to hold me accountable to that which I have committed to do. We are public servants, and public doesn't mean some, it means all. And we want to focus on areas that have been typically underserved by financial services and products. And that's primarily neighborhoods where there are communities of color, you know, tribal areas. And in these areas, you know, the financial services cost so much. You know, when I go home to Chicago, I see, you know, you can get a loan on your car title, you can get a loan, payday loans, you can, you know, pretty much get these short-term loans that really create cycles of debt. But we believe that there is a lot that we can do to be helpful in terms of financial literacy to get people ready so that they can be home ownership ready. We are actually looking at incorporating rental payments into the underwriting decisions when you're looking at homes. And that's really a huge deal, and I don't know why nobody's done that before, because a rental payment and a housing payment, those are the two largest payments that most households make. And so rents, if you're paying on time and you're paying these amounts, you know, on a regular basis, it certainly denotes character and your ability and willingness to repay. So just changing some of the things that have traditionally kept us out of home ownership are things that we're going to focus on. And again, I really hope that we are able to really move the needle. I'd want some measurable, accountable goals, like numeric goals. And again, I ask you guys to hold me accountable so that we can make sure that we're doing our part to serve all of the public and not some of it. Thank you.
It's even harder to follow Chairwoman Waters, Secretary Fudge, and Director Thompson. But Chairwoman, I want to just really thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm sort of pinching myself that I'm on a panel with these esteemed and accomplished women. And it really is a pleasure to be able to talk to you a little bit about my origin story and what it means for me to be the chair of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. Before I start, I do need to give a disclaimer that what I say today reflects my views and not necessarily those of the board or its staff. But we were asked a little bit to give a bit about our origin story, and so I thought I'd just start by talking about my parents. Both of them are from Alabama. My dad is from Plantersville, Alabama. He grew up on a farm. And his mother, my grandmother, literally kept her savings under the mattress in her home. And we know that money kept under a mattress can't grow. In order to build wealth, you need to invest. But my grandmother and others in her community, they didn't trust the banks, let alone the stock market. And for me, building confidence in the markets is essential to building wealth in the Black community. And so when I decided that I was going to go into public service, I pursued a career as a securities enforcement lawyer because I wanted to hold cheaters accountable. I wanted to go after those who were cheating the system and also undermining the confidence in our financial system. And I really believe that holding wrongdoers accountable is the way that we bolster the integrity of the system and that we then build that confidence. And so I've dedicated the majority of my career to investor protection. As the chairwoman mentioned, I spent 11 years at the SEC, where I was going after people who cheated the system and protecting investors. And then I had the honor of working for President Obama in the White House counsel's office, working on financial regulation to help level the playing field for low and middle income Americans. And I'm really privileged to now be able to chair the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. And it's more than 800 staff members who come to work every day with a mission of protecting investors. The PCOB was created by Congress with the support of Chairwoman Waters out of the accounting scandals that she mentioned. Enron, WorldCom, and other corporations were lying to investors about their earnings, and they were also hiding their debt. And when it all came crashing down, workers and investors lost billions of dollars. Workers lost their jobs. They lost their retirement savings. And the faith and confidence in our markets was completely undermined. And so Congress took the strong step of creating the PCAOB, and our job is to audit the auditors, to make sure that the financial statements and information that investors use to make their critical investment decisions is reliable and that they can trust it. And so what we do every day at the PCAOB is that we focus on investors, on workers saving for retirement, on parents who are saving to put their children through college, for anyone who's relying on the capital markets in order to build and invest for their future. Really protecting investors drives everything that we do at the PCAOB. And I know a lot of people and investors have never heard of the PCAOB, but that's okay that they don't think about us because we spend every single day thinking about them and what we can do in order to make sure that they have reliable information. And thank you. I think that right now is a critical time for this investor protection mission. The COVID-19 pandemic really exposed a lot of the financial disparities, especially in Black and brown communities. And I think that one of the ways that we help to effectively eradicate those disparities is having financial regulators that reflect the diversity of this nation. So it is really an honor and privilege to be able to serve on this panel and alongside these other women and provide our diverse voices. And I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today. So thank you.
I think we have time for a few more questions for our panelists, and I'll just address a few questions to you, and we might have time for a few from the audience. Marsha Fudge, let me start with you, because you've been telling us the story about, how those homes near you are basically assessed, evaluated, and all of that, and the difference between what happens with those evaluations and what happens to the houses on the other side where you live. And of course, we're coming into a time where now we're developing some legislation about that. And some of the stories that are being told about how Black people have had to take the pictures down inside their homes in order not to look like a Black family that's attempting to sell that house. So, you've been telling us about this for years. Would you expound on that just a little bit more?
Absolutely. They call it whitening their homes. But what we have started is what we're calling PAVE. It's the Property Appraisal Valuation Equity. It's a task force that I chair. What we have realized is that the appraisal industry is 97% white, 97% white. Communities, the darker they are, be they black or brown, the lower their valuation. The whiter the communities become, the whiter and the bigger their valuations. And so what we have done is basically said to the subcommittee that oversees it, through the White House is a part of it, Congress obviously is a part of it, this is the end of that. And so we are changing the way that people become appraisers. Currently, you have to have 1,000 hours as an apprentice. And so you have to have someone sponsor you. So what do? They sponsor people who look just like them. The testing has nothing about fair housing. They don't even teach them some of the things that realtors learn. So we are putting resources and time into changing that system. Because what we know that is if black people's homes are valued where they should be, we could almost cut the wealth gap in half, Maxine, almost in half. And the other thing that is happening that we are trying to really get a handle on is because we don't value black or brown or poor communities, we're allowing investors to come into our communities, into our neighborhoods, buy up all of the vacant homes, raise the rent so that people who could have lived there a year ago can't live there now. So we are gentrifying neighborhoods by allowing these investors to come in and buy tons of houses. So those are the two things that are my main focus right now, but Congress is also looking into this appraisal valuation.
Could we be talking about some of the hedge funds that come into the community and buy up the property, sometimes pennies on the dollar, and then rent them out, not selling them anymore, not creating home ownership, selling them, raising the rents, not investing in them, not improving them, and then evicted people when they can't pay. Is that what we're talking about?
That's exactly what we're talking about.
That's what we're talking about, yeah. Thank you so very much.
See, Maxine, she just wants me to get in trouble. She says,
tell it like it is, okay. Ms. Thompson, we need to know a lot more about Fannie and Freddie. We need to understand what happened after 2008 with Fannie and Freddie and what that has meant for the ability to support, would-be homeowners, FHA, schoolers, and where it's all going, because we still hear about people who are saying that, they're owed money because they were invested in Fannie, and all of a sudden, Fannie was wiped out. What happened with that?
So in 2008, as part of the Great Recession, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were placed into conservatorship, which means that the government is now running those entities. They didn't have capital to cover the losses based on the loans that were purchased. They purchased a lot of those loans that we had talked about earlier, those real negative amortization loans. They purchased the 228s and 327s, those products that had borrowers and homes they didn't understand and couldn't afford, and the losses were high. There were some accounting issues, and the Fannie and Freddie had trillions of dollars in mortgages outstanding. And what typically happens to financial institutions when they get into trouble, if they're a bank, they get put into receivership and they fail and the assets get traded. But Fannie and Freddie had so much in assets, they were such a big part of the economy, and their real mission is to purchase loans, and they were such a big part of that the government put them into conservatorship, and then the government took over running Fannie and Freddie through the regulator. And so there were a number of people when Fannie and Freddie were quasi public companies. They had stock, and many of the people that had stock in Fannie and Freddie in 2008, they got wiped out, or the stock was rendered almost worthless when the entities were put into conservatorship and taken over by the government. So if you were a stockholder or stock owner back in 2008, the minute that the entity was put into conservatorship, the value of the stock got wiped out. And so what we've tried to do since 2008 is really clean up the balance sheet of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, take a look at the loans that they are purchasing, and certainly the Dodd-Frank Act helped because they put in place the ability to repay rule, which means that you have to make sure that people have the ability and then willingness to repay, and there's a lot of different requirements, but they can no longer buy the loans that they were previously purchasing. And so we've been really trying to rebuild the infrastructure of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but what we've also done is try to disclose the types of loans that they are buying. Like, many people will say that Fannie and Freddie failed because of affordable housing. And to me, that's almost code for when you say affordable housing. I mean, typically it likely means low income, but what it mostly means is black and brown loans. And so people say, oh, Fannie and Freddie failed because they were trying to meet their affordable housing goals. And that is just frankly not true. They failed for a whole different reason. Having said that, they do have a mission to purchase loans across the country, not in certain neighborhoods, but in every neighborhood. And that's why we are publishing like the affordable housing loans that they're buying to show most of those affordable housing loans were not made to people that were black and brown. And so we think that transparency is important, and we want to make sure that we increase those numbers. We also want to make sure that we're working with the PAVE task force that Secretary Fudge is chairing, because they have about $7 trillion outstanding in mortgages, and appraisals are a part of that. And they previously were focused on overvaluation, where you put a price on your house, and then the price usually comes over, and that was a big part of the crisis. But when you look at the appraised value by neighborhood, as Secretary Fudge says, when you look at communities of color, it's undervaluation, not overvaluation. So they were solving for the wrong problem. And it does make a difference when you have people that reflect lots of demographic, especially the minority demographic, at the table, because people don't understand what whitewashing is. They don't understand that we look at things in a certain way, and that we have certain challenges that minorities have to deal with. And it is just really refreshing to have policy issues and have different points of view at the table that can really reflect the impact of these policies on communities of color. And so that's where we're moving Fannie towards today, trying to be equitable in how they look at the purchases of the loans that they have across the country.
Wow, thank you very much. There's so much information that it is so difficult to get the public focused on. They know that somebody is doing something about housing. They know that somebody's doing something about Section 8, et cetera. But they don't really know how it all happens. And that's our challenge, to continue to hold hearings and to bring in those responsible for these decisions so that we can help educate the public so that they can become their own best advocates. If we're ever to close the wealth gap, we've got to do this. So closing the wealth gap, I want to speak to you, Ms. Williams, about protecting the investors. While now many people think of them as the very rich, we're moving on up there, and we want to be protected too. We don't want to be ripped off as we've been historically in every way. You've been at SEC, protecting investors. Now you're doing that. Tell us how that works.
No, thank you for that question. So I have dedicated my career to protecting investors, and as the chairwoman said, it's not the rich. In order to build wealth, in order to save for retirement, in order to send your child to school, you need to be able to have confidence to invest in the markets. And so what we do at the PCAOB is, as I said, we audit the audit firms, and what we do when we're doing that is we create the rules for them. We've passed the most ambitious agenda for standard setting. That's what we call our rules, the standards for the audit firms, to hold them accountable to make sure that they are actually holding rigorous audits of the issuers of public companies. We also have to inspect those, and so one of our key focuses are inspecting the audits that these audit firms are doing, and then really in order to make sure that you have really robust inspections, the other key focus for us is strengthening enforcement, holding wrongdoers accountable. When you're not auditing appropriately, we're going to make sure that you know we mean business. We are increasing the sanctions. Just this year, we have had the highest penalties that we've ever had in the last 5 years of the PCAOB, and we're just getting started. So it's really, for us, thinking about your regular people, people who need to be able to invest and make sure that their investments are sound.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
could I just say something really quickly? I think that it is important that people realize that government was never intended to help us. And so for us to be in these roles, to expose what has been going on, I mean, right now, we still do redlining in HUD, and I run it. Because lending institutions still redline, so they won't loan people money to buy a house in my neighborhood, which I could probably go up my street and buy one for $75,000, $80,000. But because they don't loan us money to do it, small dollar loans, investors in 5 minutes will come in and buy it. I get calls every week about a house I own that my mother lives in. Are you interested in selling your house? No. So they are coming into our communities, finding ways to come in and keep us renters forever. And then the institutions were like, well, no, it's not a risky loan. They just don't do it because they don't make money on it. And so we have to start to find ways to make sure that as we are in these roles, just as you are in yours, that we expose them, that we make sure that they understand that we understand what they've done, and that we are not going to tolerate it anymore. So we fight a battle every day.
That's right. I'm pleased that you mentioned that. Before I go back to the small dollar loan problem that we had a discussion with about all of the top 7 banks in this country, I told them what I learned about Ferguson, Missouri, following the killing there, and the people who lived in houses that cost $65,000 and $75,000, paying rent, who could not get loans from the banks. However, those people came in and bought up these houses in block and then rented them back for more money. And the people who had been living there could have bought the same house and had a fair mortgage, but they are excluded from being able to do that. So that's one of the issues that we're working on with the banks. We call the banks in every year. We had the 7 biggest ones there, and they hate coming before us. They absolutely hate coming before us, chaired by a black woman who came from St. Louis, Missouri, in a family of 13 children. They're just too big for that. And so we want to know from them not only what they're going to do about small dollar loans, but they all made commitments following the killing of George Floyd, that they were going to change their ways. They were going to have diversity and inclusion. They were going to have upward management opportunities. They were going to have diverse boards, on and on and on. So we had to call them out in some instances. One of the banks did something that was, I think, done maybe far too often, and that is they interviewed a black person for an upward mobility opportunity in management, but they only interviewed him after they had made a decision to hire a white man to make it look good. And so we have a way of spanking him, and we're going to take a look at what the feds did some time ago in placing a limit on their assets and their ability to grow those assets. And while that individual and the bank has been fighting to get that lifted, I guarantee you it won't be lifted soon, okay? Thank you. Now, and I just wanted to ask Ms. Williams, with your job for investor protection, we're entering into cryptocurrency. And right now, we're creating a bill on stablecoins. And I'm looking at blockchain to see how much responsibility they have in identifying some of this fraud that stablecoins claim to have because they were supposed to have so much in reserve to equal the dollar. Now, your job is going to be even tougher, but we're moving there. Europe is moving there. In the Bahamas, they have the sand dollar, on and on and on. It's inevitable that we're going to have a digital government. And so while we're on our way to that in a few years, dealing with stablecoins will help us to rethink, to protect the investors and help us to keep from having a run on the banks that are issuers, et cetera. Have you taken a look at this huge responsibility that's coming right at you?
We have, and I just want to first thank you and your fellow members of Congress for the focus on this. And to the extent that you all make decisions about whether or not companies who are invested in cryptocurrencies have that information on their balance sheets and on their audit financial statements, the PCAOB is ready to execute on that. We already, in our inspection process, have been focused on these emerging issues, including cryptocurrency, SPAC and de-SPAC transactions, and the impact that the recent inflation and the supply chain demand has had on corporations. And one of the things that we did is we have target teams that are focused on those issues when they're going to inspect these audit firms. And so that's absolutely a focus of ours. And I just wanted to say one other thing. When you talked about bringing the managers of the banks in and holding them to account, especially on diversity, I think that, you know, one of the things that I've observed the chairwoman does so excellently is exert her influence in that way. And so in trying to sort of walk in your footsteps, every time I meet with a major accounting firm, I talk to them about what are you doing for diversity, inclusion, and workforce issues, because we need to make sure that we're diversifying those organizations, which, like you all, I am the first black person to be the chair of the PCAOB, but I'm also the first woman and first person of color, period. And as I said before, we really need to have diverse regulators because the nation is diverse, our investors are diverse, and we need to elevate those diverse voices. So, thank you.
Thank you so very much. We were hoping to have time for questions. We really don't have time to get the questions that many of you may like to have this afternoon. But let me just say this. I am so pleased that you're here. I'm so pleased that you're here because we've not had the opportunity to interact with our communities on these financial services issues. I want you to know that while we have been focused somewhat about racism and a lack of inclusion, we have not looked inside our own government to understand what the regulators do and what they don't do. While you look at these women up here, look at Marcia, you look at, you know, what she's doing in order to make sure that there's home ownership. Home ownership is important to helping to close that wealth gap. If you can buy a home, and they do appreciate, and in California they really appreciate. And so when you can gain that kind of wealth, and you can send the kids to college, you can, you know, have real inheritances to pass on, etc. We can break the chain of poverty. And so these women are very important, not only seeing that they have opportunities to purchase, but making sure that the lending is fair, making sure that they don't continue to lend to us in different ways, charging us more in interest rates, absolutely, you know, suckering us in to the kind of loans that we're going to fail with because they are predatory, all of that, and then protecting investors. And again, I kind of alluded to it, where sometimes people think of investors as, you know, very, very rich people. Your kids are investing with Robinhood. They like the way they come at them. I'm not so sure we don't have to contain them somewhat because we don't want them suckering these kids in and then closing down their ability to trade when it gets tough and they're losing money. And so they're responsible for the future wealth of our communities. These are important positions. Give them a big round of applause.
I just want to say something about the chairwoman. You heard her say that she called to the carpet the 7 biggest banks in this country. She'll call the Fed chair, the treasurer. This is power. This is power. And I think, and because she's had it for so long, I think we've become accustomed to it. But I don't know many people that can control the biggest resources in this country other than Maxine Waters. And I just think we need to be clear of it. I hate to go before her committee, too, because I'm telling you, she wear you out. And I'm her friend, and she wears me out. So, I mean, but you have to think about it that way. She controls all of us. Director has a $7 trillion operation. My annual budget is almost $80 billion, and we control another $3 trillion. She audits us all. Think about the fact that when Maxine Waters calls, we come. So thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so very much. And we're going to change a lot of things. Now, I know that maybe between the three, you'll take one question. On the front row here, 1, 2, 3. That's it? You. Are there microphones out there? Okay, all right. I just saw the look on their faces. They just had to ask something. Yes.
Hi, my name is Brittany Claybrooks. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. And I grew up in a 9-person household, so I know a lot about that. I also am a councilwoman in the city of East Orange, New Jersey, and I'm also an urban planner by trade. Thank you. My question is, how do we begin to incentivize developers and investors in our cities to really include affordable housing in their developments? One of the issues that we have is that we have mandatory inclusionary zoning and all of those things, but people are saying it doesn't help our numbers work. We don't want to invest for X, Y, and Z reasons. So what are some of the things that we can do to start to incentivize them to do that?
Well, I think there are a number of things. Most of it comes actually under her committee, but we need to provide more resources by way of low-income housing tax credits,
Okay.
CDBG, which comes from Treasury, actually, CDBG, which comes from us,
Yes.
As well as the Housing Trust Fund, which is resources that can be used for the lowest incomes. We've increased that through Congress.
Yes, ma'am.
We are trying to provide another tax credit called the Neighborhood Income Housing Tax Credit that we're hopeful is going to pass.
Yes,
We also are dealing with exclusionary zoning. I know that there are so many liberal people in this country, but the more liberal they are, the more they don't want us in their backyard.
Correct.
So we have to deal with the exclusionary zoning. But I would also say one thing that people really don't even think about is the homelessness problem in this country.
Yeah.
Because most people don't realize that 40% of the people that sleep on the streets look like you and me.
Correct.
And the fastest growing group of them is black women, senior citizens. And so we have to also look at how we balance the resources that go into housing, but they are not going to build houses as long as they don't believe they can make money. So we have to give them those incentives by subsidizing to some degree some of the housing finance agencies do some of that. So there's a lot of resources. Supply is a problem today, but I think we have to start looking at housing in a different way, Madam Chair.
Yes.
We can't keep building our mothers and fathers and grandparents' houses. So you don't have to have an acre of land to have a nice home.
That's right.
We have to start to think about it differently. What kind of housing that we're going to have in the future? Right now, manufactured housing is huge, and they are nice. Tiny homes, whatever they may be. We have to look at it through a different prism.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. Someone had their hand up over here. Who was it? Well, I'm going to just take you. Oh, he's at the microphone. Okay, they're there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for today's discussion. My name is Stephanie Garcia, and I work for the Dreamkeeper Initiative, the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. Shout out to Mayor Breed. She's here today.
Is
for
she
Alec. Yes, she's not in this space, but she's here in the yes. But I just my question was around how do we create these pipelines to home loans at a local level, and how do we move towards shifting policy within local government that really, give access to homes, and how do we bring people back to our cities that were pushed out because of gentrification?
Big questions. You want to take a stab?
That's a
at
great question, and certainly there's a lot of work to be done. This pandemic has impacted our nation and housing in particular in a way that is different than anything that we've ever experienced. When you look at office buildings in your city, and even here in Washington, people are not going to go back to work in the way that they have done previously. Are there ways that we could look at empty buildings and convert them into places that homeless or affordable to people that live in the communities? And I just think that there's just so much that we could do based on the population and the supply issues that exist at the local level. I mean, what are your options? Do you guys have housing finance agency at the county or city level? What programs are they offering? Right now, interest rates are rising. The price of homes has increased so high from year over year, and they're coming down a little bit. But the biggest issue is affordability. And notwithstanding, if you can buy a home, if you have a job, because the interest rates have changed, you can't buy what you could have bought a year ago. And the rents are increasing. And so this is a huge issue that has to be looked at holistically. We need to look at alternative ways to provide housing, whether it's manufactured housing or these accessory dwelling units or the granny units or the in-law units. And we just have to really rethink how we're going to address this issue. But there are lots of empty buildings here. Maybe we can refurbish or reformat. But we have to think about this differently and be creative in our approach.
And let me just say quickly, two quick things. One is that you need to start to look at partnering with community development financial institutions, CDFIs, and because we need to empower them, because their charge is to work with communities that need help. But the other thing I'm going to say, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying it, but Chairwoman Waters knows that over the last year, the federal government, through Congress and the Senate, have put more money into communities than they could have ever dreamed of. Make them spend it on you. They have money. The state of California has a $3 or $4 billion surplus. Billions. You from California, right?
Correct.
Billions surplus. Make them spend it on people in need. Don't let them just sit there and hold it and say, oh, we're doing so well. It's on you too. Okay. You have to hold these elected officials accountable. But Congress did their job. Now you have to do yours.
That's absolutely true. And California has a big budget surplus. We have a governor, though, that loves to spend. And he's putting it out there. And I just looked at something that he did for black women at one of our colleges, one of our universities. It was $5 million just to start a program to talk about support for black women. And it goes on and on and on. So he's pretty good. But let me just say this about infrastructure. There's so much money in infrastructure. It is one of the greatest bipartisan bills that we ever passed. But what happens when that money hits the states, the cities, and the counties? The good old boys are still in place. And we don't know what a pre-bid conference is. We need to get to the mayors and the city council. You need to put together the database. You need to call in all of these minorities who are trying to do development, who are trying to do all kinds of things that fall within the infrastructure bill. But if you don't, they're not going to get there because the people who have been making sure their friends get it are still there. And so you've got to make sure you open up this opportunity and help show them what a pre-bid conference is so they learn how it works and they'll be prepared even while they're coming to the pre-bid to meet some friends and get together and decide they're going to pool their resources and they're going to do something. So this is very important. We've got to be active. You know, Marsha talked about fighting. Yeah. People fight about money. They move you out of the way about money. They run over you about money.
Yep.
Aren't you tired of people running over you?
Yes.
Let's run over somebody else, okay?
Yeah.
And so I'm really into, people getting activated and not just sitting, wait for somebody else to do it. It's not going to happen. We have to do it. Please, one more question, and then we got to go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. By the way, I think London Breed is fabulous.
Good morning, Chair
Good morning.
Waters,
Yes.
and thank you very much. A shout out to all my black women in my life, my mother, my sister, my daughter, about whom I stand today. My name is William Funderburk. I was the Vice Chair and lead policymaker on all renewable energy developments for the largest public power utility, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, for 5 years. I'm also the author of the Equity Metrics Data Initiative. My question specifically to you, Chair Williams. As a former lawyer and litigator myself, an environmental lawyer who represented corporate America and utilities, I'd like to know what leverage you can put on the big four accounting firms, all of whom audit these public companies, to make sure that the climate money from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act is spent and deployed equitably. Because I think that that's the key thing, doing things economically and doing things efficiently, but with equity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, William, for that question.
Thank you.
So the PCAOB is very focused on making sure that we first have standards that are fit for purpose for these accounting firms to make sure that when they are going in and they're auditing the financial statements of public companies, that they're doing so at a very high standard, and that they are also, focused on the right issues, and that they're not cutting corners, and that they have quality control. So we have the most ambitious standard-setting agenda in the history of the organization, and we've been pushing forward. Right now we have 25 standards that we're updating and 8 standard-setting projects. And then one of the key focuses of our organization, more than half of our staff focus on inspections. And that's how we make sure that they're actually following the rules. We have inspectors all over the globe, including right now for the first time, we have inspectors in China for more than 10 years. The audits of public companies for Chinese companies that were listed on U.S. exchanges had not been able to be audited. And because of Congress and the work of Congresswoman Waters in the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, we right now have for the first time boots on the ground looking at these audits of Chinese companies. And what I've said over and over again is that we're going to require complete access to those audits, that there will be no loopholes and no exceptions. And so we are right now have people focused on that. We also are going to be focused on enforcement and making sure that we strengthen enforcement in those areas. So those are the 3 key areas that the PCAOB is focused on in order to deliver and make sure that we're holding those 4 audit firms to account that you mentioned.
Thank you very much. And Chair Waters, thank you for the resolution in honor of Reverend Dr. James Hester Hargett, my uncle. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank you for interest in your country, in your government. I want to thank you for interest in bringing about justice and equality. Again, nobody is going to fight better or harder than we are for what we've been excluded from. This country is at a difficult time. You need to be thankful for this president. This president has provided excellent leadership. He's living up to his promise to make sure there is justice, there's equality, and that he opens up opportunities. Now, I want you to know that you each have a role in that, whether your role is helping to register people to vote and get them involved in saving this democracy. We helped to strengthen this democracy. We made a lot of sacrifices. Your foremothers and fathers made a lot of sacrifices to strengthen this democracy. The democracy is at stake. The insurrectionists that attacked our capital, January 6th, are getting stronger, not weaker. Whether we talk about the Proud Boys, QAnon, the Oath Keepers, the KKK, they are gunned heavily weaponized, they're on the practicing range, and they're waiting from number 45 to give the word for a civil war. Now, this is real, and you don't think about that often, but this is real. The democracy is at stake, and guess what? Guess who's going to seize it? Guess who's going to make sure that we don't allow it to be destroyed? Us. Thank you very much.